Okay, we'll just give folks another 30 seconds to come in from the waiting room, and then we'll get started. All righty. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about last night's dueling town halls and everything else that's going on with the election at the moment. My name's Hillary Fry. I'm the executive editor of HuffPost, and I'm the host today. We're joined today by Kevin Robillard, Ariel Edwards-Levy, and Matt Fuller from the amazing HuffPost politics team. So they're going to break down what happened last night and also be answering your questions. I will be handing things over to them in just a moment. But first, I'm going to go through a few instructions. So first, we want to make this as interactive as possible. If you're comfortable and you can, please turn on your video. We love to see your faces. You can see ours, and we would just love it if you felt comfortable turning on your video. So please do. We also want to hear from you. The second half of this event will be a Q&A. So if you have a question you'd like to ask our panel, all you have to do is raise your virtual hand. You'll be able to do that by clicking participants at the bottom of your screen, and then you'll see a panel open up on the right with the raise hand option. You can also raise your hand like this, but we may not see you. So it's better to use the raise hand option in Zoom. If you're on a mobile device, you can click the More button at the bottom right and select Raise Hand. Please do not chat or text the participants, the panelists directly. They will not be able to answer your questions during the event. If you have a question, please raise your hand during the Q&A. We will do our best to get to your question. And when it's your turn, I will call you up live to ask your question. Also, our moderators who have pink and green backgrounds can answer any technical questions you may have. You can chat them by selecting their name in the chat. And again, they have the green and purple backgrounds for HuffPost. Lastly, if you would like to further support our journalism, we're also grateful you're HuffPost members, but think about joining as a paid HuffPost Plus member. That supports our journalism. It means a lot to us. It's another way to show your support. And you also get some extra perks, including an ad-free experience on mobile in the app and discounts on HuffPost merchandise. So to upgrade your membership, you can go to huffpost.com/subscribe. So before we get totally started, I'm going to fire up a poll here for all of you to answer. So our first question for you today is, whose town hall did you watch last night? So please share with us your answer. And without further delay, I'm going to hand it over to Kevin, who will moderate this conversation with Ariel and Matt. Thank you.
Hey everyone, this is Kevin Robillard. I'm a senior political reporter here at HuffPost. And I think we'll start the conversation off today by talking about the most recent event in the race, which was last night's dueling town halls from Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And I think it's important to note to the start what each candidate was trying to do with those town halls and what their goals were. And I think that's really interesting as a way to look at it. I think both these candidates wanted to improve the person who they're trying to change the image of right now is Joe Biden. Joe Biden wants more people to like him. Donald Trump wants more people to dislike Joe Biden. Donald Trump's image is pretty fixed. And so I think an important thing to look at how successful or not Donald Trump was in doing that was sort of the headline here, which was Trump refusing to denounce QAnon at the town hall was really the main takeaway. And I think a good place to go from there, and this is where I'd like to bring Matt and Ariel in, first of all, why would Trump refuse to do this, from what you guys can tell? Ariel, I'd be interested if you could talk a little bit about sort of what do people actually know about QAnon in terms of what do voters know from polling, and what public opinion of a group like QAnon is. For those who don't know, QAnon is a absolutely baseless, insane conspiracy theory that posits that Donald Trump is actually working with Robert Mueller to bring down a cabal of Satanist pedophile Democrats. So let's start with Matt, I guess, about why Trump wouldn't just go ahead and criticize a group like this.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the easiest answer is he's an idiot. I don't think there's really much strategically, electorally for him to gain by refusing to do that. In fact, as you said, the headline out of 2 town halls is not, Joe Biden's tax plan is this or that. It's Trump refuses to, disassociate himself with QAnon. And, it was funny, if you watch the exchange, it just doesn't pass the smell test of, him saying, I know nothing about these people. I know they don't like pedophiles. And so, that much. And he also has said in the past, he knows they like him a lot, right? It's not like this is the first question he's ever gotten about QAnon. So it's not like, he was caught flat-footed here, and it's not like someone couldn't have said, oh yeah, Mr. President, the next time someone asks you about QAnon, do this or that. I think he genuinely has this problem of chastising anyone who actually likes him, and people who like him are good and people who dislike him are bad. So he's incapable of putting it going beyond just looking at, well, what are these people doing? What are the things they're saying? Are they walking into pizza parlors and shooting up the place? He can't do that because he only sees the world through his own eyes. And, well, they like me, so they must be good, right? I don't think there's really any electoral strategic victory here by him doing that. Those people who are QAnon believers, they're going to vote for Trump no matter what. Right? They're going to show up on election day. They're not going to vote by absentee because coronavirus is a hoax. It's there's nothing to be gained. He doesn't need to gain QAnon people. He doesn't need to excite that base already. They're totally, ready to vote for Donald Trump. He needs independents. He needs people who are, country club Republicans, for lack of a better term. He needs suburban women, and that's just not getting it done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a key thing to look at here is Trump at this point, opinions of him, and Ariel, I think, can testify to this, are fairly fixed. At this point, the way he makes gains is by making Joe Biden as unacceptable as he was able to make Hillary Clinton. And perhaps we shouldn't even say that he made Hillary Clinton unacceptable to voters in some ways. But really, he didn't manage to attack Biden effectively at all during that.
Well, just a quick interjection. I think it's a strategic mistake for him to have even gone on the air and let. I mean, if he had just left it alone and let Biden go on for an hour of his own thing, they'd find something within that 1 hour to say, oh, did you really like this? I mean, don't do the counter programming because you need people to. But his gambit is, well, I just don't want you to like Joe Biden. He's just sort of a narcissist who can't let the guy have a night to himself. Obviously thought he was going to get better ratings, didn't. I just don't think there's really any electoral strategy here with him going on air doing counter programming and refusing to disassociate himself from QAnon.
Yeah. So Ariel, can you talk a little bit about what does the public actually know about QAnon? Because I think we hear a lot about how popular some of these Facebook groups and YouTube pages that feature QAnon are. But in the grand scheme of things, you could have 1 million people follow your YouTube page, and that's still only 1 out of every 300 Americans. So in the grand scheme of things, what is QAnon? How many people even know what QAnon is? And what is their opinion of it based on what we can see in the polls?
Yeah, so that's the thing, is that this, appealing to QAnon is not something that is a rational strategitic choice that a campaign would make as part of this sort of 4D chess of, oh, well, we're really going to show them by, winning the support of this group. It's one of those questions where it's sort of difficult to measure because how you ask, we found, has a huge impact on exactly how many people say they know about QAnon and what they say about it. Even in September, there was polling that found that only about half of Americans had even heard anything about QAnon. And sort of interestingly, the people who were most likely to say that they knew about it were actually Democrats who consume left-leaning news. So, people who I think are pretty much going to be opposed to that in theory. One survey question that's been done recently that's sort of interesting is the Democratic pollster Civics has been running a question asking, do you consider yourself a supporter of QAnon? Because a lot of polling tends to look at it as a sort of conspiracy theory. Do you agree with it? Do you think it's true? But it's also sort of more of a movement. It's a thing that people identify with. They're in these groups. They're sort of building off of each other's groupthink on, rather than having one sort of coherent idea about what's happening in politics. In that measure, about 6 or 7% of people said that they would identify as supporters of QAnon out of registered voters. So I think that's probably, I don't know if that's an exact measurement, that's probably a reasonable proxy, which is to say it's an alarmingly large number of people, and the percentage of people who've heard of QAnon has grown hugely over this year. It's still a very, very small segment of the electorate, and it's not the segment that, if you're down in the polls and staring into the barrel of, the election coming forward, you're going to say, well, yeah, this is definitely the group it makes sense to win over in the winning days of the election.
Yeah, and I think that's always an important thing to understand, is that a group can be very large and actually have a very big impact on the world, and just not have that large of an impact electorally. And most of those people are either going to vote Republican, or probably, I imagine, a good portion of them aren't going to vote as well. So I think there's no need to worry that somehow a QAnon army is going to come and elect Donald Trump to a second term. So I guess the question then becomes, if we're looking at the polling, and this is for both Matt and Ariel, what is Donald Trump's path at this point, if there is one? Because it's definitely getting smaller. Biden has a pretty consistent lead in both the swing states and nationally. Do you see one that's available to him? And do you see one that's possible for him to actually take? Matt, we can start with you.
Well, I mean, I guess it's always possible. I'm not going to make the 2016 mistake. There was just released an Axios piece about the potential pathways that the Trump campaign was looking at, and one interesting note was that they saw basically North Carolina was sort of key to the whole thing, that they needed to win North Carolina in every scenario. So, I mean, one pathway remains those same sort of Rust Belt, blue collar worker states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. But, there's so many ways that Biden can win at this point, and there's very few. It's sort of like Trump has to shoot the moon, with North Carolina, and then any piece of the puzzle that kind of goes away, whether it be Georgia or Florida or Texas, like it could be disaster right there for him. So, it's his electoral chances are definitely waning. We're less than 3 weeks out. What are we, like 17 days or something like that? So, this, and by the way, we're already voting. So it's not like, it's going to be one sudden rush, but it's very difficult for him to win at this point. And I think that, everyone has a little bit of the PTSD of, oh, we all said with such a high degree of certainty that Trump was going to lose in 2016. So it's obviously possible he could do it again in 20. Well, it's possible, but it's not very likely. And frankly, the polling has been pretty good and has been pretty consistent. It would take something shaking up this race, I think, at this point. And I think that's what the Trump campaign thinks too. That's why, the status quo, which is what that town hall, both the town halls really, it just maintain the status quo, I think. And I don't think that's going to get it done for him.
So Ariel, because I think I know we're going to get this question from our audience. Why should voters trust the polls this time around, when a lot of people believe the polls failed in 2016? And, what has changed there? And, how much should you trust the polls?
That's definitely a question that I think has been on everybody's mind, including pollsters after 2016. And the first thing that every pollster will immediately say upon hearing this question is, well, no, they actually weren't that wrong in 2016. And nationally, that's correct. The polls predicted a Hillary Clinton popular vote victory. They overshot that by a couple of points. In 2012, the polls overshot Romney's numbers by a couple of points, but not enough to say that they thought he was going to win, which is why we're not still talking about that. What happened was there were a couple of key states where the polls were sort of uniformly off enough that they didn't catch Donald Trump's win. And because of the Electoral College, that was enough to shift the result. And I think people felt very misled about thinking that the polls were showing a much more certain picture. It was always sort of unlikely that Donald Trump was going to win, but it was never impossible. And I think, I think as someone who was covering that, looking back, I wish I had done a better job of talking about. So when you look at what went wrong, it's sort of a perfect storm of small things. And some of those were fixable. Some of those are just sort of inherently a part of polling. So things that are fixable, if you read a lot about polling coverage, you might have heard something about weighting by education. The deal with that, as quickly as possible, is pollsters weight their samples to make the people who answer their polls look like the actual electorate. And they weight on things like gender, like age, like region, like race. Not everybody weighted on education. And that didn't used to matter, because we do know that people who have a college degree are more likely to answer polls than people who don't. But that didn't really change how they voted until 2016, when all of a sudden you saw this split where people with a college degree were also more likely to go for Hillary Clinton, those without a college degree more likely to go for Trump. And so if you didn't correct for that in your polling, then you were going to have this problem where you were having too many people who you were talking to who were more primed to be in the demographic of Clinton supporters. So that's something that's fixable. Pollsters have taken a look at that. On the other hand, one thing that we saw that is not fixable from polling is that in 2016, there was a very late break toward Donald Trump. There were a lot of undecided voters. There were a lot of voters who said that they were maybe going to support a third-party candidate. When I say a lot, relatively speaking, it was a small number of people, but it was a close election. And so you saw these people, they didn't like Hillary Clinton, they didn't like Donald Trump, and they were making up their minds at the very last minute. And when they did, they broke very hard for Donald Trump. And it's hard for polling to do that. Another thing that you will hear pollsters say ad nauseum is it's a snapshot, it's not a prediction. Polls can't tell you how people are going to vote if they don't themselves know yet. The thing I will say is this election, we have
Sorry.
I was just going to say, the thing that is different this year is that we have fewer undecideds than we did the last time around. People are sort of more making up their minds a little bit ahead of time. I think the fact that it's a different dynamic, that Trump is now an incumbent president, has sort of made this a different race. But, if you're looking at what could happen this year, I always say you can listen to what the polls are saying, but you have to actually understand what they're saying. Polls are not precision instruments. They give you an idea of where the race is. Right now, Biden's lead is big enough that for Trump to win, I think you either have to see a fairly serious polling error, bigger than you saw the last time around, or you would have to see at least some tightening in the next couple of weeks.
So yeah, I think one thing to look at is that late shift towards Trump that you talked about. That is very hard for polls to catch. That was mostly the cause, in most tellings of the 2016 election, of the Comey letter. James Comey sending a letter to House Republicans, alerting them to the fact that he was, at least very briefly, reopening the investigation into Hillary Clinton and her email server at the time. And so what we've seen this year recently, we sort of saw what may have been Trump's attempt to do that this time, which was a story in the New York Post this week about Hunter Biden. And I think this story has a lot of markings of what the Trump campaign has sort of consistently tried to do to Biden, which is interesting. Biden has a very, very long record in the Senate and as vice president from which they can pull things to attack. And they do some of that. But they've also spent a lot of time concocting more or less conspiracy theories about things Joe Biden has done. And so in this story, which has a lot of preposterous elements and is sort of just based on a false idea to begin with, they claim that Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, left a laptop to be repaired at a repair shop in Delaware, never came back and returned it. And on that laptop was evidence of basically, Biden helping Hunter with his business contacts. The story has a fundamental flaw, which is that it argues that Biden was introduced to an executive at Burisma, which is a company Hunter Biden was working for, and then because of that later was fired a prosecutor that was investigating Burisma. The problem is, or pressured the Ukrainian government to fire a prosecutor that was investigating Burisma. The problem with that narrative, of course, is that one, the international community wanted that prosecutor fired because he wasn't doing enough about corruption, and two, that prosecutor was never investigating Burisma in the first place. As you can see, that was just a very complicated explanation I had to give to all of you. And I think this is an interesting thing about where the Trump campaign has gone wrong. I lately jokingly have been referring to the Trump campaign as spending too much time in the Fox News cinematic universe, which is that basically, unless you are a dedicated watcher of Fox News, you're not going to understand what they're talking about a lot of the time. And Matt, you spend a lot of time talking to House Republicans in particular. Why do you think the GOP and the Trump campaign have sort of fallen into this trap or habit of getting deeper and deeper into their own conspiracy theories? And even if these aren't conspiracy theories, just getting deeper and deeper into these very convoluted plots.
Well, so there's a couple things here. To just answer your question directly, this is the direction of the party. This is the most vocal supporters and voters. This is their base. They're all watching Fox News. They're all watching Tucker Carlson. They're all going that direction. And frankly, when you hear your voters talking about Burisma and Hillary Clinton's emails still, and whatever the flavor du jour of Fox News is on any given day, that's sort of where House Republicans themselves head. Just on a sort of separate but related note, the reason why you're hearing 2-3 weeks out about the latest on emails and whatnot is the Trump campaign has still yet to settle on its core message against Joe Biden. They're still like A/B testing. Is it going to be Sleepy Joe, or is it going to be Corrupt Joe, or is it going to be I've done more in 47 months than he did in 47 years, which is probably their most effective attack. But it's also another one that's actually sort of difficult to explain. It's a little convoluted, and Joe Biden actually does have some accomplishments that he can point to. But they haven't found the traction like they did with Hillary Clinton. And frankly, I think you could say a lot of that is chalked up just to the sort of general misogyny that, Clinton just had this inspired this fierce hatred among some people. And it was always like, I don't like Hillary Clinton either. And it was sort of a way to explain away the fact that you were maybe Trump adjacent or a little bit prone to voting for Donald Trump. And now, it's like Joe Biden, people kind of know Joe Biden. They don't think he's the crazy person. I mean, the other Republican message that they've tried for so long is I really feel like they thought Bernie Sanders was going to be the nominee. Mm-hmm. And when that didn't happen, they just kept the playbook and decided, well, AOC and Bernie Sanders, they're driving the train and Joe's just along for the ride. Well, people don't really believe that. And, you see it during the debate itself where Trump's like, you just lost the left. And it's like, well, no, he really didn't. That's not really it. It's sort of a coalition at this point. And they, 2-3 weeks out, they still haven't figured out what their message against Joe Biden is going to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a very good example of that is at one point in the Philadelphia media market, which might be the single most important media market in the election in many ways, and just that Pennsylvania is probably going to be the tipping point state, and Philadelphia is its largest media market. The Trump campaign was simultaneously running ads saying that Joe Biden was going to defund the police, which we should note is false. Joe Biden does not support defunding the police, and therefore wasn't tough enough on crime. And also running ads saying Joe Biden was too tough on crime in the 1990s by supporting the crime bill. And those two things are not inherently contradictory, but they're pretty close to it. And it's just the type of mixed messaging that is going to mostly leave a voter confused rather than persuaded. So I think that's a very important thing about where the Trump campaign has gone wrong. And as Matt was saying, Hillary was a unique figure in how much she was loathed by Republicans. One interesting way to look at is that if you go and look before the 2016 election, even before the 2008 election, conservative authors had published dozens of books basically about how Hillary Clinton was more or less evil. No one has ever really published a book laying out why Joe Biden is sort of the great villain of American society, in part just because I don't think anyone would believe it. But Republicans, because Hillary had been around so long, starting as her time as First Lady, were able to sort of work themselves up into a fervor of hating her in a way they just haven't been with Biden. And so, Ariel, can you talk a little bit about the public's opinion of Biden at this point. He's still, oddly, when you talk to Democrats and Republican operatives, they'll often tell you that voters in focus groups and stuff like that will say to them, we still want to know more about Joe Biden, which seems like an odd thing to say considering Biden was vice president for 8 years and a senator for 40 years before that. But where does Joe Biden stand right now in the eyes of the American public in terms of his popularity?
This has actually been one of the things in this election that's been sort of genuinely surprising to me in how we've seen this play out. In that, especially after 2016, partisanship in this country is so polarized and so negative that I think there was this general expectation that it was very likely we were going to end up with another 2016 where you had two unpopular candidates duking it out. And the question is, who's more unpopular? And that hasn't actually happened to some extent. Joe Biden's numbers have not plummeted through the course of the campaign the way Hillary Clinton's did in 2016. There's still at least, a good number of polls showing him above water, in terms of favorability, which in this country and this sort of political mood is kind of an accomplishment. And, to be clear, this is not unprecedented. You don't have to go back that far. In 2012, Mitt Romney and Barack Obama were both above water. So this was sort of a relatively new phenomenon we were looking at. But, to go back to that sort of idea about defining people, in 2016, there was a study where a bunch of researchers every week or so, they would go around, they just ask people, what have you heard about the candidates in the news? And they did this through the course of the general election. And for Trump, it was this sort of never ending array of different controversies, different scandals, whatever thing he'd said, whatever thing he tweeted that week. For Hillary Clinton, emails, 2 weeks where she had pneumonia and then back to the emails. So that just became sort of the definitional message about what people were hearing about Hillary Clinton. For Joe Biden, there has not been a story like that. The Trump campaign has not really come up with anything there. And, I don't know if the Biden campaign necessarily has come up with this one sort of overarching message. A lot of their messaging is, that Donald Trump should be out of office, which has worked pretty well for them. And coronavirus has become such a big issue that Joe Biden himself, I think, at once, A, he's more popular than he might have had any right to expect. And B, he himself is sort of not the definitional figure of this campaign when so much of it is about Donald Trump. Donald Trump takes up so much of the oxygen in this campaign. And that's why one of the things about the town hall and about his strategy here is that that's not necessarily good for him. I think that actually putting him front and center is generally a rough patch for his campaign.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one thing that it's easy to forget is that in the final weeks of the 2016 campaign, Donald Trump was actually, by his standards anyway, on his best political behavior. He was very much sticking on message to the extent that during his speeches, I think he would say to himself, got to stay on message here, which is not something politicians typically do. But that, I think, really did. The focus was shifted to Hillary, and Trump was able to take advantage of that. This time around, the focus of this campaign has never been on Biden. And that's why I think voters are still wondering some things about Joe Biden. But at the same time, what they've seen, they've mostly liked. Biden at this point is slightly above water. He's not, interestingly, he's not loved by any means. His fave and approval still tend to be in the 40s generally. But it's definitely a big, big shift from where Hillary Clinton was 4 years ago.
And we should just note the strategy here of, another one of the sort of throw it against the wall, see what sticks strategies of the Trump campaign is he's inept. He's like too old. Mm-hmm. He's stumbling, bumbling Joe Biden. And then every time he goes on stage or is in public or is in a town hall, he exceeds those expectations. It's like Trump can't help himself but lower expectations for Joe Biden and then let him just easily clear them. So when voters hear from Joe Biden and it's relatively, a strong message, or he seems slightly presidential or just a little bit with it, they're like, oh, this isn't the Joe Biden that I was promised. And it doesn't seem that bad really. Whereas, if it were building the expectations that Joe Biden is going to be this incredible speaker and he's Barack Obama 2.0 and he falls short of that, I think that it would be talking about a different sort of situation among voters where every time he speaks, it's like, well, it's not so great for Joe Biden. Well, now it's like, oh, he's easily clearing those expectations every time he's out there. So it's really not that bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one thing to note is last night after the end of Biden's town hall, he had been up for 90 minutes. He stayed and answered questions from the voters who weren't able to ask their question during the town hall, which I think was designed in part both to show the message that, hey, I'm Joe Biden. I know that, and this is the thing, voters do have concerns about Biden's age. That's shown up a lot in polling. But he'll say, that's his way of saying, look, I can keep going for another 30 minutes or an hour, however long I need to, which I think was designed both to show him being willing to engage with everybody and I think a little bit to show his stamina.
All right. Kevin, are you guys ready to go to Q&A? Great. All right. So first, let me fire up another poll here for our audience. This is our second question. Is there anything that could happen in the next month? We could edit that to 2.5 weeks. That would change your mind on whom you're going to vote for in the presidential election. So please share your thoughts on that. And just a reminder about how this is going to work. If you have a question, click participants and click raise hand. I will call you up. I will ask to unmute you. And if you don't mind turning on your video so we can see you, telling us where you're from and answer your question and ask your question, and then we will answer it. So let's get started here. Scott Simmons, you've had your hand up for a while. If you don't mind turning on your camera, and I will unmute you.
Oh, good. Well, it's still morning here. I'm in California. I'm named Scott Simmons. Sorry, I don't have a camera working. It's I'm at home on the machine I remote into to work, and long technical geeky thing why the camera doesn't work. Anyway, my main question is: has anyone been able to decode the mindset of a Trump supporter? I see interviews with people waiting to go into the rallies, and I don't know, it's just baffling as to, what are these people thinking of? I heard a good analogy by Chris Rock. He said, well, you got your choice. You got rat poison or a tuna sandwich. And it's like the people are saying, well, I never did like tuna. And, and then just a comment where you're talking about the Republican versus Democratic stump. All the Republicans seem to have to go on is, oh, Joe's bad because of this, and he's going to do that. They have nothing about what's been accomplished or nothing to say about what they're doing or planning on doing. It's just all negative. Well, forget what I did or can do, or, just he's all bad. So that's their whole position, at least it seems like to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks for that question, Scott. So I think to answer sort of the second part of what you were saying first, I do think that's actually a big problem for Republicans. I was talking earlier this week to Jeff Link, who is a Democratic strategist in Iowa, and he was talking about some focus groups he did with voters almost immediately after Trump won. It was in March of 2017. And he said one thing he asked was, hey, voters, you guys, these were voters who I think had mostly voted for Obama and then moved to Trump. Write down what you think Trump promised you would do. And they had good answers. It was Trump will end bad trade deals. Trump will build the wall, generally speaking. Those same voters didn't really have any idea what Hillary Clinton was promising. Trump in 2016 was able to get across a few key things that he told voters he would do. That really hasn't happened at all in 2020. He really hasn't displayed much of a second-term agenda at all. And the second thing, as for the first question about sort of the mindset of Trump supporters, I think, we used the term, the Fox News universe before. I do think that plays a really key role there. There is an entire media universe set up for these people so that their beliefs aren't necessarily challenged and are sort of constantly reaffirmed. And I think it can be hard to break someone out of that once they're into it. But yeah, and I also just think some of these people are just Republicans. and they don't and they view, you said it was rat poison or a tuna sandwich, or I guess Chris Rock said that, but they view Biden as, maybe a tuna sandwich with rat poison on it. So I think that's the simplest answer in some ways, is that some of these people are just Republicans and they're going to excuse most behavior from a Republican president. But Matt or Ariel, do you have anything?
I'll just throw in, I think, there are a lot of different varieties of Trump supporter or Republican, which are two fairly overlapping circles at this point. I think there's probably even now a distinction between the people who voted for Trump in the Republican primary, who really were taken by his vision of America, and by people who are Republicans for whom he wasn't their first choice, but at a certain point, he was the candidate, partisanship took over, maybe they just want to see judges confirmed. I do think that sort of that idea of what in God's name are the other side thinking is sort of very inherent to the way that politics plays out in the US right now, which, media bubbles research sort of varies on exactly how impermeable those actually are. People do tend to sort of hear major events, but how people follow the news, how much attention they're paying, what they're hearing is very variable among different people. And, you keep seeing these polls that people, increasingly don't know many people who have opposite beliefs. They're watching a lot of media, consuming a lot of media that, agrees with whatever they're sort of inherently poised to think to begin with. They think the other side is dangerous. They think that the people who disagree with them are not coming from the same set of basic facts that they are. And so I think it's sort of hard to break out of that, because at a certain point, partisanship becomes this sort of black hole sucking people in, where, when what you're hearing and what you're consuming is all from where you were originally, what is going to break you out of that? And throughout Trump's presidency, we kept seeing these moments where his opponents were going, well, surely this is going to be the game-changing moment at which Trump supporters stop liking Donald Trump. And there was not, I don't think we ever saw one moment where most of his base turned on him. People generally know who Donald Trump is and what they think about him. He's the same candidate that he was 4 years ago. But there is, this small but crucial number of people who are a little bit more flexible. And, over the course of this year, it's often been sort of prosaic things that have sort of changed them more than any one major incident. You saw his support wane with things like failing to, get Obamacare repealed early in his presidency. And, you've seen some softness now around the way that he's handled the coronavirus pandemic. So that's sort of more a universe of thoughts than I think a coherent answer, but hopefully that sort of touches on some of those things.
Yeah, and I would just add that, I don't think there's a monolithic, Trump voter, but it's a sort of coalition. But I would say, sort of underlying the whole thing, underneath every Trump voter, there's, you have to be a little bit more comfortable with racism, a little bit more comfortable with misogyny. And, the thing that I think a lot of Trump voters are attracted to is this sort of culture war aspect, that they really, they fear the Antifa and BLM protests, and they don't want a socialist agenda, and they don't want this country going soft and being politically correct all the time. They kind of like that Trump has those, to use a euphemism, rough edges, and they like a country where, men can still be men, and think of the things that have really motivated and animated Trump voters and Republicans in the last 4 years. And I think one of them is really the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. And that was a major turning point in some ways, where, those people really got fired up about, defending this country and defending this man against accusations from a woman. And those are the things I think that are sort of a common thread a little bit, right, among all Trump voters. And if it's not, if you are just judges, well, you have to be a little bit more comfortable with it than some other people, certainly a lot of Democrats.
All right, thank you. Quickly, we've got our poll results back. Just to note that 94% of folks today say that their mind will not be changed when it comes to voting. 5% say yes, and one person is not voting. I always account for that with international attendance. So let's not judge without knowing all the facts. Okay, next I will call up Christopher. I'm going to say Duker. I hope I'm saying your last name correctly. I'm going to ask to unmute you. And if you don't
So
mind
can
saying where
you
you're from.
hear me now?
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Okay, great. And by the way, you nailed my last name, which is rare.
Oh.
Americans don't like the two vowels together. So my question is for the entire panel, and it has to do with terminology. And I'm just going to use the examples of Obamacare, which may sound a little, well, I guess it's still a current issue, and court packing. So Obamacare, the Democrats didn't come up with it. The mainstream press didn't invent it. Obamacare is a term which, by its very nature, implies dictatorial overreach. This is his care imposed on the rest of us. It is not a neutral term.
Mm-hmm.
So, at right-wing leaning institutions like Fox News, of course they use it. That's partly what they're paid to do. But the New York Times, the Huffington Post, NPR are not paid to push right-wing perspectives on things like the ACA, which is actually easier to say than Obamacare. So why do they do it? Why do they accept these terms uncritically? Court packing is another term which is inherently sounds like something skeevy, some kind of overreach. It was coined not recently, but it was coined by people who opposed FDR's plans to expand the court. We could say court expansion. We could say court balancing. There are any number of other ways that one could say it. Court balancing would be arguably propagandistic for the left. Court expansion, as journalists, ideally, you're probably, I assume you want to find the most neutral language you can. Court packing, however, wouldn't be it, and I already see it proliferating pretty much everywhere. So is this a problem? How do you see this shaping the way that the press receives issues like this? Does the press have an obligation to challenge terms like court packing and the quotation marks around it? The problem is that oftentimes over time, those fade away, as was the case with Obamacare, and then it just gets normalized. So I'll shut up now.
No, I'd love to jump in on this. I came from a very straight-laced, sort of stodgy journalism background of a place called CQ Roll Call, where we didn't even address the healthcare law as ACA. Right, we address it as the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, Public Law 111-148 ;152. We were very conscious of the fact that terms matter, right? You often see Republicans doing this clever little wordplay where they won't use the word democratic as an adjective. It's the Democrats' crime bill or something like that. I get what you're saying. So on Obamacare, he kind of lost that message when Obama himself endorsed the use of Obamacare. So it became less of a partisan slanted thing. It was like, well, if Republicans and Democrats are using it that way, and this is just basically for clarity at this point, everyone kind of knows what the law is. And by the way, I'd also mention that Obamacare has, I believe, and Ariel might be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but a Democratic strategist told me this week it has the highest approval rating it's ever had right now. So it's really, yes, I agree with you, and certainly there are terms out there that journalists have an obligation to sort of explain or not just embrace. Court packing is an interesting one. I don't know where it's at on people's first impressions of the term court packing, but when you explain, what that really means and how we've already been going through is a version of court packing, I'm putting quotes around it at the moment, which Mitch McConnell, again, he embraced that himself earlier. I think it was earlier this week. I've lost all sense of time. But yeah, I agree with you that terms are important. We shouldn't just embrace any framing that people like. I will say Obamacare is an interesting one, and it's certainly one that you could write a book about. But the moment that Obama himself endorsed it and said, I like it, I think it's great. And frankly, by the way, there are worse terms than Obamacare, right? It's like the implication is he cares. That was sort of, that war was sort of lost because it just became the shorthand for the ACA, which you still hear ACA. But the ACA itself is not the proper name, right? It's as I said, the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act, Public Law 111.
And can I say one thing that does matter there, particularly for our friends in the print media? Obamacare is a shorter word to put in a headline than healthcare law or Affordable Care Act, which plays a larger role in shaping headlines than I think most people know, and then a lot of journalists would like to admit is what you can fit in there. The court packing example is really interesting. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that sort of the historian in history, court packing, when Roosevelt tried it, came to be viewed as a mistake, or as something where he was going to go too far, which maybe it wouldn't have been. He never went through with it. And I think it's been interesting to watch who's using those terms. Last week, we wrote about why Joe Biden was sort of not giving a direct answer on whether or not he would add seats to the Supreme Court. And as we were writing that, I noticed that Biden does often refer to it as court packing, whereas supporters of the idea typically say expanding the size of the Supreme Court or something along those lines. And I think that can be indicative of how Biden would really prefer not to add seats to the Supreme Court, but I don't think he wants to rule out doing it. But I think it's indicative of his attitude. But you're right. Look, these terms get disputed over. I think one of the great coups in this area has been Republicans managing to get right to work to mean a law that essentially is designed to break up unions. So look, and some of those things, we're constantly getting arguments about this. Another one we constantly hear about is the Associated Press style, which HuffPost follows, is for just pro-abortion rights or against abortion rights. When surprising that we don't say pro-choice or pro-life, and occasionally I'll get emails from people on either side of that saying, why aren't you calling it pro-choice or why aren't you calling it pro-life? And so look, we do spend a lot of time thinking about these things. But I think on the case of Obamacare, I do think Matt's right, is that Democrats embraced the term and then it sort of spread out.
Over.
And I think in the long term, it might end up being good for Obama's legacy to have what could end up being a very, very popular social program.
And I'll just throw in super quickly, writing poll questions. This is something that comes up a lot because you want to be very careful about how you're framing an issue and whether you're sort of inadvertently pushing it to one side or the other. With the court example, I think we were going with something like, do you support or oppose adding more seats to the Supreme Court? But I think one of the things that can be really interesting to watch is sometimes alternate language will have a really big effect. Like if you ask it a different way, the results will change completely. People will change their minds. The framing really matters. Sometimes people know what they think about an issue, and no matter what you call it, it's not really going to make that much of a difference. And I think Obamacare, ACA might be one of those examples. When the law first passed, when it was sort of going through its most unpopular phase, there was a period of time where calling it Obamacare rather than, the healthcare law recently passed probably hurt it a couple of points. I don't know if that will be true today.
All right, thanks guys. We've got about 10 minutes left. We've got a lot of hands raised. We'll see what we can do there. We also have one more poll here for you all. Is there any chance you will split your ballot this year? Meaning you'll vote for some Republicans and some Democrats as you look down ballot. So please answer that. And next up, I will call Wendy Cole. Your camera's already on because I noted your cool Pink Floyd background. I've just asked to unmute you and share your question and where you are.
Okay. I live in Bucks County, PA, just outside of Philadelphia, and I'm surrounded by Trumpsters, both working class and wealthy, who vote for their stock portfolios. I hear what you're saying about the bubble that people in the Republican Party tend to live in. My only concern is even if the Democrats were to, God willing, sweep the administration, take the entire Congress, what is going to happen with all the people that are still in that bubble once the Democrats are in control? That has me very, very worried.
Yeah, this is the thing. There's never going to be a total political victory for one side or the other. And that's just sort of the history of America in many ways. And look, I do think it's going to be interesting to watch what's going to happen with some of those voters. The Republican Party's overall coalition is very old at this point. It is quite literally, and we tend not to try to be this graphic about it, but it's quite literally dying off. And the younger people coming in are much, much more liberal. Millennials are already far more liberal than their predecessors were. Generation Z makes millennials look right-wing at times with some of the opinions they hold. They are easily the most, from what we know so far, only a small portion of them have entered the electorate. From what we know so far, they're clearly the most liberal generation in the history of American politics. So I think part of that is some of these things are just going to slowly move to the left, and it's not going to be quick. And look, Democrats are probably going to, if Democrats do sweep to control of the federal government, they're probably going to lose a lot of seats in 2022. This is just the back and forth that always happens in American politics. The question of, what happens to the people in that bubble, I think that's going to be really interesting. I think it'll be interesting to see how some of the social media companies respond, because they play a role in keeping people in these bubbles. How Facebook and Twitter respond, Facebook in particular, and I think YouTube is the other real force here, more so than Twitter. I think that'll be interesting. And I think another really, really big question, and we've seen some reporting on this in recent days, is what happens to Fox News when Rupert Murdoch dies. There's some indication that his heirs may not look as favorably on Fox News as it is now as he does. There was some reporting, I believe, in the New York Times and in the Daily Beast on those questions. And so I think all of that, which plays a large role in creating this media ecosystem, to what extent does it change? But that's not something that, the Democratic Party as an institution can necessarily do much about. And I think that's going to be a very, very interesting question over the next 4 years. But I will say you can already see even Republicans are starting to move to the left. If you watch some Republican advertising this cycle, you have someone like Dan Crenshaw, who is a rising Republican star by many accounts, but very, very conservative. He's currently running ads how much he supports solar and wind energy, which is not something Republicans in Texas were doing 4 years ago. And basically every Republican ad is now saying that they support protections for pre-existing conditions. They're no longer talking about repealing Obamacare. So look, you can see evidence of these shifts already happening. And if the Republican politicians go there, their voters will likely follow. I think that'll be part of the answer. But ultimately, there's still going to be a big back and forth between Democrats and Republicans for, as far as the eye can see.
And look no further than Bucks County, Brian Fitzpatrick. Certainly it probably has a solid claim to being the most liberal Republican in Congress, and might actually survive once again another sort of bluish wave here that we're looking at for House races. He could be a sort of a model for what Republicans look like in the aftermath of this, or we could go a different direction. We could go totally that Trump, Republican model, and just the country further goes, apart, where it's further on the left and further on the right, and there are less people in the middle. There are less Bucks counties out there in America.
All righty. We've got our poll results back. It looks like 88% of people who answered the question do not plan on splitting their ballot. 11% said yes, and we've got one non-voter at 2% representation there. I think we've got time for one more question. I'm going to call Robert Yetta. I'm going to ask to unmute you. I think your camera's already on. There you go.
Oh, okay. This is my first Zoom, whatever. I'm not very political, but what I am is I'm old. I'm on a ventilator. And I lived through the last 4 years, but I don't expect to live for the next 4. But I'm more concerned on the elderly, the way they're treated. We are not expendable. We're not getting anyone to help us deal with our emotions. Living under the COVID pandemic is stressful. So what I've done is I've written up my experiences over the last 24 years. And I've tried to find out if there's a format. Every senior person over 50 should read what I've written because it's going to help them settle in with who they are and what's coming. And people under 50, if you read it, you're going to know what you're looking forward to. But I'm having a problem because I only started to do this in the last week because it's the way the political thing is going. I can't be silent anymore. I am afraid, not for me, but I'm afraid for everybody else. And seniors
Robert,
need help.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but do you have a question for the panelists?
Yes.
Okay. I just don't want to run out of time. So if you
Okay.
can share your question, they'll be able to answer it. Thank you.
Why does the public health seem not able to get the real reason why Trump's health is? I want to see what his x-rays were. I want to know if in fact he actually did have COVID. Why is the healthcare people in this country stymied with gathering? Because his health is important to everybody, but we seem to be lost in not being able to find the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And how can we fix that?
Yeah, this is a good question, and this is something that I think we've seen some Democrats start to talk about doing after what happened with Trump. There's always basically been a norm that presidents should disclose as much information about their health as possible. Trump has clearly a number of times broken that norm, dating back to the somewhat mysterious trip he took to Walter Reed more than a year ago, I believe at this point. So I think that is really going to be something that'll be interesting to see whether or not a new Democratic Congress, if there is one, or even Republicans, if they take it, make some action there to sort of maybe mandate that some more of this information becomes public. And I think that's going to go along with a lot of other questions about how Trump has abused the presidency in so many ways. And this is one example of that. What do Democrats do? What do Republicans do in order to potentially prevent future presidents from doing that? And that could be hiding information about their health. That's hiding their tax returns. That could be, in the case of Trump, having a business empire that intersects with the public policy decisions he's making. And I think you haven't heard a ton about what they would do on that front from the Biden campaign in particular. You've heard a little bit more about it from different Democrats in Congress. Matt, have you been following any of those pieces of?
I just want to add. Well, first of all, Robert, I'm rooting for you. I hope you see more than 4 years here.
Mm-hmm.
Second of all, you're right. This is a serious issue, and I think it was certainly emphasized during the coronavirus situation when Trump, has coronavirus. I do believe that he certainly had it, but his doctors were not giving straight answers. We're giving very political answers. We're in some ways being more than evasive, almost bordering on lying to us. That's a serious situation. Even when it's sort of small things, whether it be his height, so that he's, they've always kind of played around with his height here. So he's right on the edge of being in a body mass index of obese. And it's like, sometimes he's 6'2" or 6'3", sometimes he's 6'4". A lot of people are like, I don't think that guy's 230 pounds. There's a lot of things that are kind of hokey about this. And frankly, doctors going up there and saying, well, we had to basically lie to you so that the coronavirus didn't, because of the patient or something, giving these ridiculous answers, that's not going to cut it. And I think that in the future, this will be, he's violated a lot of those norms, but they're going to have to become more than norms. And going forward, whether it be, presidential candidates must disclose their finances in more direct ways than financial disclosures, and must actually disclose, real healthcare information. Those things that's coming down the pike, because it's always been sort of part of the conversation. It was just that it was sort of expected. It was an unofficial rule. And now that we've seen that someone could violate that and voters don't care, I think those things are going to have to be more de jure, really.
Yeah, I think, it's always a little situational. If you look back to 2016 versus 2020, 4 years ago, Republicans were more likely to say that a candidate or a president's health should be public record than Democrats were. That has now switched, sort of depending on what's in the news at the time. At the same time, I think there is a broader question about public trust in the administration that we've seen very clearly people don't expect the White House to tell the truth. And in the middle of a pandemic, that's obviously a problem. Even over the course of this year, Trump started out with pretty good ratings on coronavirus. People started off saying that they had a pretty decent amount of trust in the government for what it was telling people about coronavirus, and that they've lost that trust. They sort of have lost that edge over the couple of past months. And I think that has real consequences beyond, just the information about the president himself, which is obviously important, but whether people are going to listen to government recommendations more broadly.
We are at time. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Fans of HuffPost, we love to see it and hear from you. Thank you, Kevin, Matt, and Ariel for joining us today and this great conversation. There will be more of these. I don't know if we'll squeeze one in before the election, but there certainly will be after. But we will keep you posted, and you'll hear from us about that. Lastly, one more note that if you love this event and love our reporting, please consider becoming a HuffPost Plus monthly or annual paid member. You'll get those perks I mentioned before, no ads in your app and discounts on HuffPost stuff. And lastly, we would love to hear what you thought about today's event. We take your feedback very seriously. We tweak these things as we go forward based on what you tell us. So please fill out our short survey. It should take less than 5 minutes to fill out and tell us how we did and what future events you'd like to attend. There will be a link to this survey dropped in the chat here in the Zoom. And if you can fill that out, it would be great. So thank you all so much for joining us, and we will look forward to seeing you again next time. Take care, be safe, thank you.
Thanks everyone, thanks for joining us.